I really do not care for these Disney remakes, and I don't mean that as any cynical mockery, more like that I am apathetic to them. I can hardly say I've watched all the ones made thus far aside from a few outliers, so I couldn't make a thought piece about them without really going into detail about the mantra that the company abides by in the digital age. Is it partially Alice in Wonderland or Tim Burton that suckered audiences in? Or could it have been something brewing from behind the scenes during their acquisition of Lucasfilm and Marvel Studios? It honestly can be quite messy to comprehend, but it also seems to generate a lot of vitriol within the animation community. Soulless imposters doing little to bring the spark to the imagination, whilst puppeteering their IPs is a means to disturb and alienate the viewer from the more auteur forms of entertainment. Kinda weird why the Vultures didn't go after the animated puppet first. A lot of folks might not know this about Pinocchio when it first came out, but it was actually considered more or less a flop in its early years. The 1940 film, based on an Italian children's serial by Carlo Collodi, is most likely the first version you think of when it comes to the story of the Pinocchio character. Unlike Walt Disney's first animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio only made back $1 million against a $2.7 million production cost. This was primarily because World War II cut off the European and Asian markets overseas. It was a harsh decade for Disney, as many of their early films weren't making enough to fund future productions until the end of the 1940s. This began the trend for Disney to reissue many of their films every 7 to 10 years, with Pinocchio eventually making back its money and then some by the 1970s. In fact, by the time it came to VHS in 1985, it grossed a pretty solid $167 million and would sell copies galore despite being considered lower rung amongst its contemporaries. Thus began the rise of its prestige amongst the frivolous masses, and many considered it a classic animated feature that pushed Disney into what it is today. And that company also saw the potential of VHS sales figures, and began to repackage their Disney classics into safe, profitable sequels. So yeah, you can say Pinocchio has some blame for creating the rise of straight-to-video classics like Cinderella 2, Mulan 2, and an extremely goofy movie to name a few. This became the company's breadwinner that eventually moved them up from the dark age in the 1980s and into the mega conglomerate juggernaut it is today. And what's a safer option than sequel straight to home video or remake straight to streaming? Which brings us to this.
I've got it. Chris Pine!
Oh, sweet baby Jesus. Nora Ferguson brought to the production crew in the midst of finishing Snow White a translated version of The Adventures of Pinocchio. Walt immediately gravitated to the concept, busting in guts with enthusiasm, as Ferguson recalled. Although, when you look at the original text of Pinocchio, it's pretty sadistic. The cricket doesn't even survive the first act. Pinocchio squishes him with a hammer. And that's not to bring attention to all the other crude nonsense this wooden puppet commits. To that end, things needed to be altered and become more family-friendly, in a conservative sense. The original story was merely surrounding the human condition and the morality that looks to strive oneself to become more truthful. The writers had to modernize Pinocchio to be far more friendly in this version, and it came right down to his design. He was originally going to be more wooden and true to his literary counterpart, but the problems with that came with sympathy for the little guy. He needed to be more naive for the narrative to work, and with a few more alterations, they got the character that could sell on shirts. The other enhancements of the feature were several techniques picked up from their first feature-length film being fully expanded on. This included moving layers for pan shots, and the many techniques incorporated into the climax of the film, like the bubbles or the ocean waves. Where something like Snow White was more structured like a European fairy tale, the plot of Pinocchio played more like an episodic serial, much like from its original inception. Stromboli's Caravan, Pleasure Island, and the encounter with Monstro are very loose in their connections to one another, with only some minor characters lacing them in between. Although the Blue Fairy dropping off a post-it note to Pinocchio seemed less like a narrative choice and more like a forced plot device.
It says here he went looking for you, and he was swallowed by a whale.
Swallowed by a whale?
I wouldn't say Pinocchio is a very cohesive plot line. It regularly skips out on outright answering some low-hanging questions surrounding the outcome of folks like Honest John and Gideon, who are supposed to be put in jail in one of the original drafts. But in saying that, I do believe that letting its villains get away with their horrible actions showcases the power gap between those on the bottom with those on top. Instead, we must focus on bettering ourselves and not be led into their temptations. It's a story that is timeless in the right sense, and comes around by the end as overall one of Disney's finest achievements in feature animation. Expressive and atmospheric like Snow White, but with an engaging character-driven narrative bundled with some of the darkest depictions of hedonistic punishment ever to be seen from a children's film. The song When You Wish Upon a Star is often seen as emblematic of Disney Corporation, and is sometimes used as a means to defame or criticize the Disney company and its lax agendas. Making a wish on a star is a fantastical phrase taken from a modest European view on the pursuit of dreams, which Walt Disney, despite his views, seemed to really latch onto when it came to business and animation. But how I view this little touchstone of their branding is by the 1950s, it becomes their hallmark theme. Pinocchio is the pivotal moment in the company's history to fully legitimize them as a brand, but also a pivotal moment in the coming times ahead. Cause going from a small studio with dreams big and small to the biggest monopoly in the business has its obvious dips in quality. And not in the quality of its work, it's the quality of its staff. Because Pinocchio did make a lot of money, so did Fantasia as well. There was a growing union movement going on in the entertainment industry, and Disney animators were becoming less patient with the lower rates of pay the company was giving out. Thus, during the production of Dumbo, 300 out of its 800 employees picketed signs outside the studio in Burbank, California, and demanded pay increases for those lower on the totem pole. And when Disney agreed to the demands of the Screen Cartoonists Guild, they apparently wanted to sign it without Walt himself in attendance. Now, this greatly affected his attitudes towards organized workforces, since he was always a man very against socialist ideals. From the public side, this was a major friction in the studio, and throughout their hills and valleys, this moment in particular affected Disney the most up until his death. I wasn't lying when I said Pinocchio is a major part of dynamic shifts in the Disney company, and this very much leads us to today, and Disney's branded remake gravy train that made the little wooden puppet a CGI uncanny valley effect.
Go ahead. Make a fool of yourself. Then maybe you'll listen to your conscience.
Hey 90s kids, do you remember the Disney Renaissance? A period in time when Disney brought their animation studio back from the dead and created what many considered their most successful run of films? A very short period up until Tarzan, where they're making gangbusters on their animated properties. This was mainly due to the amount of talent brought onto these projects, such as the directors, animators, and lyricists who got the ball rolling and redefined Disney at the turn of the millennia. But when it comes to the actual dollar signs, that's been surpassed by our current era, the Disney Revival era. From 2009 onwards, Disney has fully embraced the changes to their animation department concerning 3D animated features, downsizing 2D animation based on the okay box office performance of The Princess and the Frog. And where Disney Renaissance had major success in crafting films from the ground up, the Disney Revival is more concerned about reaping the benefits of the older classics, considering that their audience has grown up. And I don't mean by giving them the live-action makeup, I mean that in the meta-commentary of the Disney brand. The problems with female heroines, the dead parents tropes, and some of those bad faith criticisms that are about as dated and overly passé as those old gamer comics from the mid-2000s.
Teaching another girl to read isn't one enough.
So films like Frozen, Wreck-It Ralph, and many others try to go that same route, with various levels of quality. I mean, nice to see all the Disney princesses in the same movie. I can't say they help with the writing because it's kind of sloppy.
Do you have daddy issues? I don't even have a mom. Neither do we.
Not to say that taking jabs at your own tropes and cliches can't be enjoyably fun. It's just sometimes not adequate to the film's relevance. If anything, it doubles down on several issues that were present in Disney films prior, yet still has a more difficult time addressing more problematic issues, like racism and inequality. It largely ignored it, like in Dumbo's live-action film, where the contentious and controversial Jim Crow, yes, that's the name the animators gave this guy, yikes, was written out, and the black magic feather Dumbo uses to fly is turned white. Make it that what you will. It just harkens back to this old 1981 quote from Disney Renaissance CEO at the time, Michael Eisner, saying, "We have no obligation to make art. We have no obligation to make history. We have no obligation to make a statement, but to make money. It is often important to make history, to make art, or to make some significant statements. We must always make entertaining movies, and if we make entertaining movies at times, we will reliably make history art, a statement, or all three. It wouldn't be far-fetched to say that despite this stance on the integrity of status to help them storm the seas, eventually it's gonna catch up. Competition became fiercer and made more dollar value. The Disney theme parks began to suffer major blowback from the public. And mismanagement and a hasty shakeup in the executive branch from a coup attempt by Walt's own brother, Roy E. Disney, all happened under Eisner's watch. This is why it seems fitting to many that Eisner's replacement, Bob Iger, was more willing to not take any risks into new ventures and merely acquire new properties and studios to make and maintain profit value. Regardless of quality or art, in the short term, this is considered a safe, lucrative bet. But I don't want to step on the same talking points that many others have discussed over the years, but mainly wanted to paint a picture as to why Pinocchio, the remake, is a film to begin with. A film I find to be the most botched attempt of a Disney live-action production since, I guess, The Lion King in 2019. It hits the same story beats as the original, dragging out certain key moments with a bunch of filler that doesn't need to be in there, and casting A-list actors into popular roles, even if it's merely an imitation. I'll give it to remake Dumbo that it tried to add a whole new second act to its film, unlike Pinocchio, which only presents itself as more inept and clueless when compared to its counterpart. The visuals of the live-action Pinocchio are easily the most widely disliked feature of the film, and it's coming from many different angles. Daytime and nighttime shots have their own issues with brightness and shadows respectively, and the film less discernible for audiences when compared to the flat yet charming painted backgrounds of the original. The computer-generated models are all over the place in their design, with Honest John and Gideon having more realistic animal features, but Pinocchio with a more cartoony design reminiscent of his original with little to no change. It's sort of a reversal of that ugly Sonic design from the Sonic the Hedgehog movie. It's like Disney didn't communicate well with their special effects departments and left their designs to be so radically different from each other that it botches consistency. But maybe they'll make it up in the next Marvel project. And the next one. And the next one. And how many are they supposed to make in less than 1 year again? The set locations are also not as memorable as they were in the animated film. Geppetto's cottage, filled with clocks and wood carving tools, and Stromboli's wagon with hanging puppets that correlate with Pinocchio's horror. Even the inside of the whale is more spectacular in its presentation than a dark, luminescent cavern with little to no personality. Strange to say when it's just an inner stomach. But maybe the biggest criticism when it comes to the visuals has to be in it all just feeling cluttered. Take for instance the Pleasure Island portion of the feature. This seems to be the most different when comparing the two films, and the one people like to praise the most. The original can be seen as more of a summer fair with fewer attractions and only a handful of rides. Yet with how little the original presents, the attractive nature of them just makes them more memorable. The rough house encourages speeding strangers up, the mansion where you break as much stuff as you want in it, or the classic 8-ball pool hall where Pinocchio and Lampwick hang out in. Many of those same locations are still presented in the remake, with some exceptions like the Tabasco Corner, for obvious reasons, but add a lot more thrilling, yet more painfully obvious attractions. Some are fine, like shooting fireworks or the Candy Mountain, but then you have breaking clocks, shoplifting, and the weirdest one of all, Contempt Corner? Oh no, they're saying bad stuff to other people, but not like swearing at folks and using suggestive language, more like the comment section you'd see on a YouTube or Facebook video. And even then, it's pretty tame. To put it simply, the sky is the limit in how you depict this version of Pleasure Island. Yet the remake merely facilitates how uninspired and repetitive these ideas are. It's weird because this is coming from Robert Zemeckis, who's very well known for his affiliation with motion capture technology. Although he wasn't the first director for the remake. As the first one, Paul King, left the production for family-related problems, and the script was rewritten many times over when Robert came on board. And I know a lot of people love his contribution to cinema with Back to the Future and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but to be honest, man's not who he used to be. Nowadays, he's known for his brief, albeit significant motion capture fiestas like Polar Express and Beowulf, and often were criticized for having models being lifeless or empty. Even Disney took jabs at it once.
Talking to us?
Obviously.
But it looks like you're talking to that window.
It actually looks like I'm looking right at you.
He's well regarded in his direction and visual pageantry, yet what was charming and innovative at the time has now become smoke and mirrors and coordination. There were probably a lot of hands pulling this film from side to side on what Pinocchio was going to be about, and Robert just seemed like a background character in this. His penchant for the spectacle was only showcased in the Pleasure Island part of the feature, whereas the rest are just paint-by-number story beats from the 1940s film. So I really can't blame him for the way this film turned out. He was just the most available filmmaker with a knack for working with effects-heavy productions. He wasn't the puppet master for Disney's failed remake. It's just Disney itself. The original film starts with a lovable Jiminy Cricket presenting a first-person narrative as he accounts the events of the future.
Of course, I'm just a cricket singing away from hearth to hearth, but let me tell you what made me change my mind.
Throughout this movie, it's implied that he also knows he's merely just a character in the storybook and will often break the fourth wall.
As I live and breathe, a fairy. He's a success. Gosh, maybe I was wrong. Well, here we go again.
And this is charming to an extent. It never overstays its welcome and doesn't distract from the story. But much like today, every Disney property has to play the Deadpool card. If a character is self-aware in itself, let's make it dead straight that this is a Disney fairy tale. The remake, starring Joseph Gordon-Levitt as Pinocchio's conscience, or temporary conscience.
I hereby appoint you Pinocchio's conscience.
Temporary conscience.
Sure, temporary conscience.
Makes a meta-critique of the phrase once upon a time. It doesn't go anywhere or say anything profound, it's just there.
Never understood that expression. How can you be once upon a time? Hey, who's telling this story? Me or you? Well, who are you?
And similar to that moment, every subsequent moment can be seen as just that. It's padding out scenes that don't need to be extended.
Oh, brother. It's like I've dropped into H-E double hockey sticks.
But as egregious as it might be, it's not the worst example of Disney going full meta in its attempt to stand out.
A real boy? Why on earth would you want to be real when you can be famous?
Honest John refers to Pinocchio as an influencer.
An entrepreneur, nay, an influencer.
Then he tries to give him a stage name referring to Pine, a Chris Pine, if you will.
I've got it. Chris Pine.
Now, this only adds more confusion to the tale they're trying to present. Do influencers exist in 19th century Italy? Was Chris a popular name at the time? Why do all the Disney references in Geppetto's shop exist in separate timelines? Or high-thigh slit dresses just a trend back in his time? These aren't just added in as quick cameos, but more like exploited devices to send home the fact that it is a Disney film and they do what they do best, selling you shit you don't need. It takes you out of the story and reveals itself as being just a void. Sure, the original animated film has its moments of playful banter and outdated slang more befitting of the 40s.
What'd I tell you? Ain't this a swell joint?
Who's his conscience anyway? Me or that hoodlum Lampwick?
Come on, take a big drag.
Yet despite this, it was in its own world of wonder that didn't need an explanation, which is why animation is probably the best at conveying a sense of place and fantastical engagement. The temporary suspension of the convention to which Jiminy Cricket will exhibit in the original does not distract, but instead immerses the audience in its world. But it's a totally different ballgame when the metafiction just kinda takes you hostage and doesn't apply anything of substance to counteract that. Cool to know that Chris Pine, the actor, exists. Cool to show you have all these properties under your belt. Haven't seen a mega corporate film company flex in front of us since Space Jam 2.
Winter, I say, winter is coming!
I'm not trying to badmouth material that breaks the fourth wall. It's a convention that's a neutral field to play in. But you gotta know when to let the characters do the talking and not the audience surrogate feeding you any top-of-mind awareness. And this isn't the first nor the last time Disney has done this meta commentary on their popular IPs. The more you try to point something out, the more you start to lose the meaning behind what those previous accomplishments stood for. Essentially, you're robbing the magic. Yeah, I guess it's time to talk about the fairy in the room. The Blue Fairy is fairly divisive in her role in the animated film. She gives life to Pinocchio, presents him with his dilemma to pursue in the film, and proceeds to come in and out whenever Pinocchio needs to get out of a jam. This happens in Stromboli's wagon and outside Geppetto's home. Her inclusion in these pivotal scenes are certainly quite lazy, waiting for the character to get out of situations they'd otherwise figure out themselves. Deus ex machina is the correct term for this. So as to applaud the remake in some measurement, I have to give it to them that they did put more effort into making Pinocchio and Jiminy more competent, letting them get out of situations without the Blue Fairy MacGuffin. However, what happens is that it essentially reduces the fairy's role in the feature. We don't get much of a personality from her appearance, and in the scene she's in, they imply that she kinda doesn't know what she's even doing here. She shoots a laser beam from the picture of Geppetto's dead son. Oh yeah, he has a dead son in this. Jesus Christ. Pinocchio comes alive, but somehow lacks identity, which the Blue Fairy fixes up.
I'm the Blue Fairy.
I'm the Blue Fairy.
No, I'm the Blue Fairy.
No, I'm the Blue Fairy.
Oh, I see what the problem is here.
Then the fairy seems surprised to see that Pinocchio isn't actually a real boy.
Well, if Geppetto wanted a real boy, why would he carve a puppet?
Why add this? Cause the original version knew exactly what she was doing there. She made Geppetto's wish come true. He wanted a real boy, and she took the first step in making that happen. Now it seems the fairy needs the characters to explain it all over again, as if she didn't know what to expect from this. She then speaks out Pinocchio's goal, sings a famous song, and disappears from the rest of the movie. A weird choice considering that you can easily write her into other parts of the movie without making a contrivance out of it. The original serial didn't seem to have the issue, and she actually was the one who represented Pinocchio's conscience outside the cricket because, well, he's dead. And thus, we have a film that cuts out an essential character from the rest of the feature and now has to pedal all along the same path without a good alternative, because that also affects the characterization and message of the original film. An example comes when Pinocchio is approached by the fox and the cat. In the original, Pinocchio is wide-eyed and curious about the world around him, considering he was literally born a day ago. So it makes sense that he'd ignore the conscious effort of Jiminy Cricket to go live life as an actor, since he seems to trust such fabrications from a sleazy conman. The remake implies that Pinocchio has had days to assimilate to Geppetto's lifestyle and is even wise enough to go to school, which is a very different turn from the original. But we need to have him get to Stromboli's wagon, so let's kick him out of school for being different.
Get out and stay out! School is for real children, not the ridiculous puppets.
Honest John and Gideon come back and make the same proposition to Pinocchio, which he reluctantly agrees. There's a quote from an article by Amy Nicholson on the New York Times that perfectly describes his conundrum. The key problem is the film's fear of the original author, Carlo Collodi's theme, that children are raw material inclined to sloth, foolishness, and self-serving fibs. Walt Disney's 1940 cartoon softened the tyke's sins to rambunctious naivete. Now, he's been flattened out of having personality at all. His lumping goodness turns a hot-tempered fairy tale into a dull after-school special about peer pressure, which seems to suggest that Geppetto should just carve himself a helicopter to parent the boy. The plot merely pushes itself onto Pinocchio instead of Pinocchio foolishly making mistakes himself. To the point where in some scenes, the relevance of Jiminy Cricket is proven mute when Pinocchio seems to figure out right from wrong all on his own, making him, honestly enough, a temporary conscience.
How come you didn't bust any of them cuckoo clocks? Any real kid would love to smash those clocks.
It just didn't feel right. Well, Mr. Coachman, it sure sounds fun.
But I don't trust you.
I don't want to be a jerk. I want to be a real boy.
So there really is no arc for him to overcome, other than the obvious morals he's forced to learn. Remember the whole famous nose growing whenever you make a lie scene? Well, Pinocchio uses that to great effect and solves the inciting problem a la Shrek 2.
It's a thong! Ow! They're briefs! Hold on, R2!
Hey, Jiminy, you want to know something? I don't want to be a real boy.
The moral becomes muddled in the confusion thereafter because now it seems that lying is bad unless it is used in your favor and can get you out of situations. I kind of want to make a political joke, but that's kind of like low-hanging fruit there. The problem with removing the Blue Fairy from the original film's narrative is that the writers seem to have no workaround for these methods. And with keeping on a very tight deadline, they couldn't showcase the fault of Pinocchio's character where he seems to lack character at all. Even more so than the original one, which was already quite watered down from the source material. And forgive me for saying this, but for all the grandstanding Disney makes in casting a black actress in the role of the Blue Fairy, the fact that she has less screen time than her white counterpart is fishy. Also, the Redskin stereotypes in the original aren't even mentioned in the remake. It just goes to show that Disney will approve self-aware excerpts about their cliches and tropes, but it seems to board up any mention of racism from their company library. Now, I forgot to mention in that Stromboli scene that another character plays a significant role in the feature that was a new addition. Too bad, it's just a ballerina on a string. Pinocchio 2022 is an hour and 15 minutes long and needs to justify that length by adding in new characters and scenes. Some seem fine on paper and don't really add much to significantly alter the film. The biggest addition is the character of Fabiana, who plays a role in the film as one of the puppeteers mistreated by Stromboli. Her involvement in the narrative seems as though it was an added feature to the story rather than from the original source material. There might be some contention as to where the sequel fits into this, though it could be a different interpretation of the friendly pigeon that gave Pinocchio a ride to his father out at sea. Fabiana grows a close relationship with the wooden boy, but sees that only through her puppet Sabina can she really get a clear understanding of his plight. She spills out plans of breaking up Stromboli's puppet show and putting together her own friendlier version of it. In fact, by the third act, Stromboli is put in jail for his abuse of his exploited employees by the police, whereas in 1940 Stromboli never committed any crimes but can still be seen through his abuse of Pinocchio, such as when he threatened him with an ultimatum. Stromboli is seen as the only character in the film to get what's coming to him, and the unionization of workers suffering under that rule is the best way to ensure a more healthy work environment. A very interesting addition to the story of Pinocchio, seeing that we just discussed Disney's relationship with unions. It's kind of like that added character occupation in Mary Poppins Return.
It's the Society for the Protection of the Rights of the Underpaid Citizens of England.
A labor organizer.
Now, the big question kind of lies in why add this into the story? Yes, it's good that we should be recognizing more attempts at organized unions in the labor market, seeing that it's been on the decline since the 1980s. But why is Pinocchio one of those stories? It's similar to the cruelty against animals and circuses moral that was in the remake of Dumbo. Again, a public outcry with a legitimate acknowledgement that we are against it. However, it doesn't really matter much in the story, gets overshadowed by other plot lines, and just sounds cynical as it's coming from a company that more or less benefited from it in the past. The same goes for Pinocchio's new plotline, as well as Disney's interest in painting the individual and not the systems in place as a threat to overcome. The original Pinocchio villains never got their grand comeuppance in the animated film or even in the story, because they were a part of a system too embroiled in corruption for someone to easily take down. People like the coachman, who'd exploit children for cheap labor based on a conspiracy of lawless freedom. The only lesson to be learned from this is to never fall into temptation. Folks like these are always going to exist, and it's important to not be led into their deception, lest you turn into a jackass yourself.
What's he think I look like? A jackass?
Pinocchio doesn't seem like the right story to sprinkle in labor strikes or trade unions. It's about responsibility, perseverance, and the ability to contrast right and wrong. Stromboli's sequence seems to be more of a critique of escapism in the entertainment industry, an angle well suited for a modern interpretation of this story. Yet this part of the movie, like Dumbo's animal cruelty message, doesn't offer a substantial enough connection to the story, and should have been scrapped. If Disney wants to acknowledge any problems in today's society, well, it shouldn't be in the line of making quick dollar signs on an audience you raise prices on for your Disney Plus subscriptions. Throughout the video, I haven't really got much into the character of Pinocchio himself, but this is generally the biggest grievance I have with this remake. Why is Pinocchio made like this? What do the dead son and wife do to Pinocchio's character? And every single misfire that the remake has, including the minor tidbits like the music and song structures being all over the place. Like seriously, are these kids supposed to be backup singers or not?
So play, 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 play time to play!
It all collides with Pinocchio's personality. Pinocchio in Disney's original cartoon was the product of many rewrites and redesigns, as he needed to be less like a puppet and more like a boy who just so happens to be a puppet. The puppet's features were made to distinguish himself from the rest, yet his actions still constitute what a young child would be. He is a curious individual, but is quite gullible, and often falls for people older than him, giving him false answers. When he returns from Stromboli's wagon, he's stopped by Honest John and Gideon again, and is conned to thinking he has a sickness. The cure?
A vacation on Pleasure Island!
John then gives Pinocchio a card of aces, a very clever symbolic gesture, as though it were a ticket. When Pinocchio gets on the carriage, he then starts to think that every other kid is on that coach because they have tickets themselves.
Ever been to Pleasure Island?
But Mr. Honest John gave me...
Me neither.
And it's that level of genuine disposition that makes Pinocchio believable. He'll do bad things and make mistakes, but that's what a kid is. He goes on to achieve acts of redemption by learning and committing to being better through selflessness. Pinocchio in the 2022 version doesn't have such dimensions. He's really just playing mimicry with his 2D counterparts. He'll do the exact same things and fall for the many antagonist schemes, but it is in the aftermath of very shoddy writing. The sequence at school where when he's kidnapped via the net and pressured into going to Pleasure Island are such moments not motivated in part by Pinocchio's naive personality, but more by the plot just driving him to the story beats. He doesn't even participate in much of the chaos and rambunctious behavior the other kids partake in. The original did, and in return, he was punished for it. Most of the time, Pinocchio's remake seems to be like the one goody two-shoes and highly moderate character that appeals to Disney's overall image. The guy who drinks water at cocktail lounges, aka the guy you don't bring on Thursday nights. And that also doesn't help with the ending, as instead of Pinocchio making the sacrifice, Geppetto is the one that dies. Then some fairy magic brings him back to life, and he tells Pinocchio that it was all about being yourself. Then Pinocchio becomes a real boy? ? Yeah, this ending doesn't make sense, and completely flubs the simple moral that wasn't that hard to mess up. Suppose the story wanted to be nuanced with it, fine, more power to ya. But you can't simply just decide to mix in a based on interpretation angle to the tale that was pretty straightforward from the start. Was it trying to tie into Geppetto's son that he was trying to replace him with Pinocchio?
I wanted somebody else, but it was you I was wishing for.
It's never made clear what the whole point of the ending was, and the resolutions it kind of leaves unopened. Leave it to the audience, maybe they both died and that blue light is just heaven, who knows, I don't give a about it. And that's what really upsets me about this movie. It's not quite doing a full retread of the same old beats as the original. It actually cuts a few scenes out for the sake of pacing, yet without the ingenuity and creativity that the animation provided, it leaves this version of Pinocchio feeling hollow. Now it's full of nightmare-fueled CGI and cookie-cutter messages that are too afraid to let kids drink alcohol, and instead have off-screen ADRs saying it's root beer.
Root beer! Root beer! Look! Free root beer! Root beer!
Here you go, Jen Sabaton!
And that's the real heart of the issue with Disney remakes as a whole. They lack that finesse to really be their own thing, and are afraid to stray away from Hollywood's tried-and-true formula of never stepping far from their apple patch. Rich character development comes from said characters going from point A to B better than they were before. Remake Pinocchio doesn't have those same qualities. A more sanitized and market-friendly version that is more a wooden husk than a real boy. We're living in a weird timeline right now. We've had this year at least 3 or 4 Pinocchio movies come out, and with the exception of Del Toro's stop-motion flick, I've had more fun with just the Pauly Shore dub of that Russian Pinocchio than this one.
Father, tell me, when can I leave to be on my own?
Mamma mia! It wouldn't buy!
As much as I let on the achievements of the original film, that's only based on how well put together a feature of its time was handled. It has story issues, and as an adaptation, it doesn't quite capture the spirit of its darker counterpart. I see it more as a landmark in animation than an actual movie masterpiece, and it's where the remake of Pinocchio and just all the other remakes in general seem to miss the point on. Animation is a beast of its own, and not just a simple genre to put a label on. It cannot be cheaply written off and should be given the respect it deserves. But like many forms of art, it has its poor imitators that seem to be playing catch up. Disney remakes are a trend, and once there are no more movies to be made, it will be like the animated sequels of yesterday. Disney will always be its own worst self, and it will be reflected as time goes on based on its decisions as a company in relation to its audience. In the end, Disney's Pinocchio remake did teach us one little tiny lesson: to never drop down to the temptation of profit, and to be more respectful of films that actually have real legs to stand on. Thanks for watching this video, and tell me down below what you thought of this Disney remake or other remakes in general. Please hit that subscribe button and ring that bell to get notified about my latest video. Also, follow me on Twitter to see what I can get up to and whether or not I can really get through another live-action Disney film. It's your bra man, and I'm gonna take a nap now.